At approximately 8:10 in the morning of June 19, 1944, the American submarine USS Albacore fired 6 torpedoes at the Japanese aircraft carrier Taiho as she completed her turn into the wind to launch aircraft. Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu, who had just been launched and was circling above the fleet in his Zero fighter, saw the torpedo wakes in the water below. He broke formation and dove his aircraft into the path of one torpedo, destroying it. 4 of the remaining 5 torpedoes missed the carrier entirely. The 6th struck the Taiho's starboard hull forward of the island at approximately 8:14 in the morning. No fire started immediately. The flooding reached the forward elevator pit and the aviation fuel storage tanks positioned below it. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who commanded the entire mobile fleet from the Taiho as his flagship, ordered flight operations to continue. 6 hours and 20 minutes later, the aviation fuel vapors that the flooding had been producing since 8:14 detonated and destroyed the ship from the inside. 1,650 of the Taiho's 2,150 crew were dead when she sank at 16:28 that afternoon. The Taiho had been the most advanced carrier Japan had ever built. She sank on the first day of her first combat mission. 1,650 dead. 2,150 people had been aboard when she sailed. 1 torpedo hit. 6 hours and 20 minutes from that hit to the internal explosion. 3 months and 12 days from commissioning to the bottom of the Philippine Sea. If this story matters to you, subscribe to the channel. Just subscribe. That is all. Thank you. The Taiho was designed in direct operational response to a specific problem. At the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, American dive bombers had destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single day by penetrating to the hangar deck and igniting the aviation fuel and ordnance that were stored or actively being moved there. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu all sank within hours of the dive bomber attacks because the bombs they absorbed penetrated to the hangar deck, and the hangar contained aircraft in various stages of being rearmed and refueled for follow-on strikes. The IJN understood the specific mechanism of their own destruction at Midway and designed the Taiho as the carrier that would be immune to it. The primary engineering solution was an armored flight deck, the first ever installed on any Japanese carrier design. The steel plate covering the flight deck was designed to stop any bomb the Americans could deliver in 1944 before it penetrated to the hangar deck below. The Taiho was designed as a modified and significantly improved version of the Shokaku design. Her full combat load displacement was 37,270 tons, far exceeding the Shokaku class she had been derived from. Her armored flight deck was constructed of 75 millimeters of hardened naval steel at the centerline, tapering progressively thinner toward the outboard edges. She was designed to operate approximately 53 aircraft in combat configuration, fewer than the Shokaku class, because the weight of the armored deck had reduced the internal volume available for aircraft stowage, fuel, and ordnance. She was powered by 8 Kampon high-pressure water tube boilers, driving 4 sets of geared turbines, producing 160,000 shaft horsepower total. Her designed maximum speed was 33 knots under favorable sea conditions. She was formally commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy on March 7, 1944, 3 months and 12 days before she was sunk. She was the most capable and most expensively constructed carrier Japan had ever produced for fleet combat operations. She also had a specific structural vulnerability that the armored flight deck could not address. The Taiho was heavy enough at full combat load that her lowest hangar deck sat very nearly at the waterline. The forward aircraft elevator pit, the mechanical shaft through which aircraft were moved between the hangar deck and the flight deck, extended below the waterline at its lowest structural point. The aviation fuel storage tanks for the ship's aircraft were positioned below the elevator well and deeper in the hull, in locations chosen during the design process for reasons of structural weight distribution and ship stability. This arrangement meant that any torpedo hit that compromised the structural integrity of the forward elevator pit would also directly expose the aviation fuel storage tanks that had been positioned below it in the lower hull. The armor on the flight deck was entirely irrelevant to a weapon that struck below the waterline and below the armor's protective coverage. Ozawa had been designated to command the Japanese mobile fleet for Operation Eigo, the decisive naval engagement that Japanese strategic doctrine had been building toward since the earliest months of the Pacific War. His flagship was the Taiho, the newest and most capable fleet carrier Japan possessed. His fleet for the operation consisted of 9 carriers of various sizes and types, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, and dozens of escorting destroyers. He had approximately 430 operational carrier aircraft at the start of the battle. He launched 4 separate strike waves against Task Force 58 during the morning hours of June 19, 1944. The Albacore found the Taiho during the preparation for the first of these strike waves, while the carrier was in the middle of her aircraft launch cycle. Commander James W. Blanchard commanded the USS Albacore on the morning he sank the Taiho. He had maneuvered the Albacore into firing range of the carrier during the operational confusion of the fleet's launch cycle. A carrier turning into the launch wind predictably maintains a predictable course and speed for several minutes, long enough for a submarine already in position to complete a full torpedo attack. Blanchard fired all 6 of the Albacore's Mark 14 torpedoes in rapid succession. He watched through his periscope as a Zero fighter dove into the path of one torpedo and destroyed it on impact. He watched the Taiho continue launching her aircraft. He tracked the trajectories of the remaining torpedoes through his periscope. 4 of them missed entirely. 1 struck. Komatsu's decision to use his aircraft to destroy the torpedo was made in seconds. He was above the fleet, having been recently launched, and was positioned at altitude to observe the incoming torpedo tracks in the water below. He had no weapon capable of intercepting a running torpedo in the water below. He had an aircraft. He used it immediately as a weapon. He died in the act of destroying 1 torpedo of the 6 that had been fired. The action was documented in Japanese accounts of the battle and has remained one of the specific individual acts of the Pacific War for which there is clear and unambiguous documentation. A pilot, watching his ship about to be struck, choosing to die in order to prevent 1 additional hit. His individual action did not save the Taiho. The torpedo that hit her struck 2 to 4 minutes after Komatsu destroyed the other. The ship Komatsu died to protect sank 8 hours and 18 minutes after the surviving torpedo struck. The impact struck the Taiho's forward starboard hull. The explosion that followed flooded the forward elevator pit with a mixture of seawater, lubricating oil, and aviation gasoline from the fuel lines and tanks that ran through and below the elevator well. This flooding produced no immediate visible fire. The mixture of seawater and aviation fuel in the flooded pit did not ignite from the initial explosion. There was no visible damage to the armored flight deck above the torpedo impact. Ozawa's operational assessment, made within minutes of the torpedo hit, was that the ship had sustained manageable damage and that flight operations could continue without interruption. He ordered the Taiho's aircraft to continue launching on the scheduled timetable. This decision was entirely rational given what Ozawa knew at the specific moment he made it. The ship appeared structurally sound from every observation point available to the bridge. The flight deck was undamaged and fully operational. The damage was below and forward of the bridge, in a compartment that had been flooded with what appeared from available reports to be a manageable amount of water. Continuing flight operations was the operationally correct choice, given the information available to any flag officer at that position that morning. What Ozawa did not know was what was happening in the space below the elevator pit. The aviation fuel that had been released into the elevator pit by the torpedo explosion was vaporizing at ambient temperature. Aviation gasoline of the high-octane type, used in Second World War combat aircraft, vaporizes rapidly under normal temperature conditions. The vapor produced by the released fuel in the enclosed elevator pit began spreading through the structurally adjacent spaces. It spread upward through the elevator shaft structure toward the hangar deck directly above. It spread through ventilation connections and the natural gaps in the ship's internal structural partitions. It spread because the structural design of the ship, with the elevator pit at or below the waterline, had created pathways through which the lighter-than-air vapor could move upward. The damage control crew recognized the developing vapor accumulation within the hour after the torpedo hit. The smell of aviation gasoline vapor accumulating in enclosed and poorly ventilated spaces is distinctive and immediately recognizable as a serious danger. The crew understood that the vapor was present throughout the lower ship spaces and that it was continuing to spread through the ventilation paths. The operational question was how to address it effectively. The correct procedure for managing aviation fuel vapor in an enclosed naval vessel is to isolate the affected compartments and use directed, controlled ventilation to move the vapor safely out of the ship through designated exhaust points on the exterior. The damage control officer on duty made a different and catastrophic decision. He ordered the ship's entire ventilation system open to full operating capacity, with all ventilators running simultaneously, with the stated intention of dispersing the accumulated vapor throughout the ship. This decision accomplished the precise opposite of what had been intended. Opening all the ventilators moved air through the ship's interior at maximum rate, but it did not extract the vapor from the ship in any meaningful quantity. It redistributed the vapor from the spaces where it had been concentrating to every space connected to the ship's ventilation system. The forward elevator pit and its adjacent compartments, where the vapor had been accumulating for hours, connected to the ventilation system that now carried their vapor content to the hangar deck, the lower deck spaces, the machinery spaces, and every other interior space served by the ship's ventilation. By noon of June 19th, the Taiho's entire internal volume was permeated with aviation fuel vapor at concentrations that any ignition source, however slight, would detonate. Tozawa continued flight operations throughout this period. Aircraft from the morning Japanese strike waves returned from the engagement over the American fleet and were recovered aboard the Taiho. They were carrying various degrees of battle damage from the engagement over the American carrier task forces. They landed with malfunctioning systems, superheated engine exhausts, and in many cases, live aviation ordnance that had not been expended during the strike. Each of these recovered aircraft represented a potential ignition source aboard a ship whose entire interior was by this time saturated with explosive aviation vapor. The flight operations that Ozawa continued, because the ship appeared structurally intact, were being conducted above a hangar whose air had become explosive. At approximately 14:30 in the afternoon, an ignition source that the historical record has never definitively identified detonated the accumulated vapor. The explosion was total and nearly simultaneous across all the enclosed spaces that the vapor had reached. A staff officer standing on the bridge at the moment of detonation watched the flight deck rise. The sides of the ship erupted outward from the force of the internal detonation. The internal structure of the Taiho, from the forward elevator pit through the machinery spaces aft, was destroyed in an explosion that observers on every ship in the Japanese mobile fleet could see from the water and physically feel in the hull. A second massive detonation followed the first within minutes. The Taiho came to a complete and immediate stop in the water. Ozawa had been at his command station on the bridge when the first explosion occurred. His immediate flag staff survived the initial blast. The decision was made immediately to evacuate him from the doomed ship and preserve the flag officer who commanded the entire mobile fleet. He was transferred to the destroyer Wakatsuki, taking with him the imperial portrait that was kept aboard all Japanese fleet flagships as a required and sacred object. He did not go down with his flagship. Though some accounts indicate he initially considered remaining aboard, he continued to command the mobile fleet from the Wakatsuki and later from the cruiser Haguro as the larger naval battle continued in the waters around him. The Taiho, without propulsion power and listing severely to one side, continued to settle progressively in the water. She capsized and sank stern first at 16:28 hours on June 19th, 1944, 8 hours and 14 minutes after the Albacore's torpedo had struck her hull. 1,650 of her crew went to the bottom of the Philippine Sea with her when she sank. The 500 survivors of the Taiho were rescued from the surrounding sea by the escorting Japanese destroyers. The sea immediately around the sinking carrier was covered in aviation fuel that had spilled from the ruptured storage tanks during the initial flooding and again when the ship's hull ruptured in the final internal explosions. Some survivors were pulled from this fuel-covered water by the rescue ships. The destroyers that conducted the rescue were operating under the same difficult tactical conditions as the rest of the mobile fleet. American submarines remained active in the area, and the air engagement that had destroyed most of Ozawa's carrier aircraft was still in progress above the fleet. The rescue was conducted under these tactical constraints, and concluded when the operational situation required the escorting destroyers to rejoin and screen the remaining fleet. Of all those who had been aboard when the Albacore fired its torpedoes that morning, 500 left the Philippine Sea alive. The timing of the Taiho's sinking relative to the Shokaku's sinking on the same day represents a specific and operationally painful fact about the state of Japanese carrier aviation in June of 1944. The Shokaku had been sunk by the USS Kavala approximately 6 hours before the Taiho's internal vapor explosion. 2 Japanese fleet carriers had been sunk on the same day by American submarines, while the carrier air groups they had carried were simultaneously being destroyed in the air above the American fleet. The Taiho had been the most modern and most advanced carrier Japan had built. The Shokaku had been the most battle-experienced. Together, they had represented the operational core of Ozawa's mobile fleet. Both were gone before the sun set on June 19, 1944. The Taiho's armored flight deck was never tested in combat by the attack it was specifically designed to resist. No American dive bomber penetrated or even seriously attacked the Taiho's flight deck on June 19th. The armor that had been the defining design feature of the most advanced carrier Japan had built. The armor that was supposed to represent the lesson learned from Midway sat between the sky and the hangar that was not the source of the ship's destruction. The armor protected the hangar from attack from above. The torpedo had arrived from below and to the side of the ship. The design solved the problem that had destroyed 4 carriers at Midway and left the Taiho vulnerable to the specific problem that the torpedo's flooding introduced. The Taiho's loss on her first combat deployment represented a specific and irreversible kind of naval tragedy. She had been commissioned into service in March of 1944. She had completed her shakedown period and her cruise training cycle. She had been designated as the flagship for the decisive naval engagement that Japanese doctrine had been building toward for the entirety of the Pacific War. She flew Vice Admiral Ozawa's flag. She was his central command platform for the battle. The officers and crew who served aboard her were the product of training programs that the Japanese Navy had developed and refined over 3 years of wartime experience. She took 1,650 of those officers and crew with her when she sank. 1,650 crew members assigned to the most important ship in the Japanese fleet did not survive the first day of its first combat deployment. The specific character of Komatsu's decision deserves to be understood separately from the question of whether it changed the outcome of the engagement. He was a pilot who had just been launched from the Taiho's deck. He was in the air above the fleet, separated from the ship by water and altitude. He could see from his altitude what was happening below him in the water. He saw the torpedo tracks running toward his ship from directly below. He understood immediately and completely what they meant. He had an aircraft and nothing else. He used the aircraft. His decision was made before there was time to reason through the consequences in detail. He saw the tracks, understood the precise threat they represented, and dove. He died at approximately the same moment that the torpedo he intercepted would otherwise have struck the Taiho's hull. The ship was struck anyway by one of the other 5 torpedoes. The action Komatsu took was irreversible and immediately final. The outcome it was intended to prevent occurred anyway, through a different mechanism entirely. The specific command decision that Ozawa made to continue flight operations after the torpedo hit was not irrational given what he knew. He was the fleet commander, with a battle to fight. He had a battle to fight. His ship had been hit, but had not caught fire, had not lost propulsion, had not lost speed, and had not lost use of its flight deck. The damage that was visible from the bridge was manageable. Continuing operations was the tactically correct decision given what any flag officer at 8:15 in the morning could observe and assess. The catastrophic decision that destroyed the Taiho from the inside was not Ozawa's. It was made by a damage control officer below decks who chose to open all the ventilators. That decision was made below the bridge level, entirely out of Ozawa's sight, chain of command review, and direct knowledge. When the explosion came at 14:30, Ozawa was commanding his fleet from what he believed to be an intact and fully operational flagship. The armored flight deck of the Taiho was never struck by an enemy bomb in combat. The steel that had been installed to prevent the penetration that had destroyed the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu at Midway was never tested. No American bomb reached the Taiho's hangar deck. The armored flight deck was the engineering solution to the Midway problem. It was irrelevant to the mechanism that destroyed the ship. The torpedo that sank the Taiho struck below the armor, below the flight deck, below the hangar deck, at the forward elevator pit that extended below the waterline. The armor that cost so much weight and made the Taiho heavier than any previous Japanese carrier sat between the sky and a fire that was never lit from above. Hit subscribe right now, because coming up is the central paradox of the Taiho's destruction. Why the carrier built to solve the Midway problem was not destroyed by the Midway problem. What the ventilation decision produced in the 6 hours between the torpedo hit and the internal explosion, and what the Taiho's destruction on her opening combat deployment means about what happens when the weapons a Navy builds are forced into conditions they were not designed to survive. Do not go anywhere. The Albacore completed her attack, dove to depth, and spent hours under sustained depth charge attack before surfacing to assess her condition. Commander Blanchard did not know what he had sunk when the Albacore finally returned to the surface. He knew he had fired at a large Japanese fleet carrier from close range. He knew 4 of his 6 torpedoes had missed the target entirely. He knew 1 had been destroyed by an attacking Japanese aircraft. He knew 1 had struck the carrier's hull below the waterline. At that moment, he did not know whether the carrier had survived the hit. The sounds his crew tracked underwater in the hours after the attack included those of a carrier continuing to operate, aircraft recovering, machinery running, fleet movements above. The Taiho did not yet sound like a ship that was mortally damaged. She sounded like a carrier that had absorbed a torpedo hit and was continuing normal flight operations. The sounds of the Taiho's destruction, when they finally came, reached the Albacore from a considerable distance. The internal explosion of the aviation fuel vapors at approximately 14:30 was audible through the water and hull of the Albacore. The structural breaking up sounds that followed were distinct and unmistakable. Blanchard reported a probable fleet carrier sinking in his patrol report. The Albacore returned to Pearl Harbor without independent confirmation of the specific identity of what she had sunk. The full and specific confirmation came from Japanese naval records examined by Allied intelligence teams after the war ended. The Albacore had sunk the Taiho, the most capable carrier Japan had ever built, on its first combat deployment. The single torpedo that Blanchard had tracked, striking the carrier's hull, had produced a flooding event that the ship's own damage control crew had converted into a catastrophic internal explosion. The Shokaku had been sunk earlier the same day by the USS Kavala. The comparison between the 2 sinkings illuminates the specific mechanism that made the Taiho's loss unique. The Shokaku was sunk because she was actively refueling aircraft when 3 torpedoes struck her hull, with aviation fuel flowing through open transfer lines to the aircraft on her hangar deck. The fuel that had been in the transfer lines at the moment of the torpedo hits ignited almost immediately. The Shokaku's fires began within minutes of the torpedo strikes and were never brought under control. The Taiho was sunk by a fundamentally different sequence of events. A single torpedo hit produced flooding without fire, and a damage control decision made 6 hours later produced the internal explosion that destroyed the ship. The Shokaku was sunk by the specific active operational conditions she was in at the moment the torpedoes struck. The Taiho was sunk by the damage control decision that was made in the hours that followed the torpedo hit. The role of Komatsu's action in the sequence of events on June 19th deserves a specific accounting. He destroyed 1 of the 6 torpedoes that Blanchard had fired from the Albacore. If he had not intervened with his aircraft, 6 torpedoes would have run toward the Taiho instead of 5. 4 of the 5 that reached the ship missed. 4 of the 6 would likely have missed as well, given the spread pattern Blanchard had calculated. The question is whether that additional torpedo, had it struck the hull, would have changed the eventual outcome. A second torpedo hit on the Taiho's hull would have produced additional flooding in a second location. Additional flooding would have meant more aviation fuel vapor being released into the ship's interior. More accumulated vapor throughout the ship would have made the internal explosion more severe and more immediate. The outcome in that hypothetical is not obviously different from what actually happened. A carrier, destroyed by internal explosion during active operations. Komatsu's deliberate death saved the Taiho from receiving one additional torpedo impact. It did not save the Taiho from the vapor accumulation and the ventilation decision. The specific failure of the ventilation decision is worth examining as both an operational and an institutional problem. The damage control officer, who ordered all the ventilators opened, was not acting randomly or carelessly. He was applying a principle that has general validity in many other contexts. Fresh air movement disperses dangerous concentrations of vapor or fumes. In a warehouse or any open space with spilled gasoline, opening doors and windows to create natural airflow is correct procedure. In a naval vessel with a sealed interior ventilation system, however, opening all ventilators does not bring in fresh air from outside. It circulates the interior air at high speed, redistributing rather than removing whatever is suspended in it. The damage control officer applied a well-intentioned principle from a different context to a situation in which that principle produced the opposite of the intended effect. His training had not adequately prepared him for this specific type of emergency aboard this type of ship. The Taiho was on her first combat deployment at sea. This specific emergency, on this specific ship, had never occurred before. The question of whether better training would have saved the Taiho is the question of whether a correctly managed vapor emergency could have prevented the internal explosion. The correct procedure would have involved isolating the affected compartments around the elevator pit, cutting off the ventilation system to prevent redistribution, and using targeted, directed ventilation to exhaust the vapor through specific controlled outlets on the exterior of the ship. This procedure, correctly applied within the first hour of the vapor accumulation, would have significantly reduced the vapor concentration in the ship's interior. Whether it would have been sufficient to prevent all ignition is not certain. The vapor production from the flooded elevator pit was continuous as long as the aviation fuel in the tanks below was vaporizing. A correctly managed emergency might have delayed the explosion, reduced its severity, or in the best case, prevented it. What the incorrect management produced is documented. The explosion came at 14:30, 6 hours after the torpedo hit, and consumed the ship from within. July 10th, 1941. Keel of the Taiho, laid at Kawasaki, Kobe. April 7th, 1943. Taiho launched. March 7th, 1944. Taiho commissioned. 3 months before she sinks. June 15th. American invasion of Saipan triggers Operation A-Go. June 19th, 8:10 a.m. Albacore fires 6 torpedoes. Komatsu destroys 1, 4 miss, 1 hits. June 19th, 8:14 a.m. Single torpedo floods forward elevator pit, no fire. Ozawa continues flight operations. Approximately 9 to 12 a.m. Aviation fuel vapors accumulate through lower decks. Damage control officer opens all ventilators. Vapors distribute throughout ship. June 19th, approximately 14:30. Internal explosion. Flight deck rises. Sides blow outward. Second explosion. June 19th, 1628. Taiho sinks stern first. 1,650 dead. 500 survivors. Same day, USS Kavala sinks the Shokaku. 2 fleet carriers lost to submarines in 1 day. June 20th. Hio sunk by American carrier aircraft. 3 fleet carriers lost in 2 days. 4 factors explain the sinking of the Taiho: the elevator pit design, Ozawa's decision to continue flight operations, the ventilation decision, and the institutional condition of a crew on its first combat deployment. The first factor was the structural vulnerability of the elevator pit. The armored flight deck protected the hangar from above. It did not protect the hull below the waterline. The forward elevator pit's extension below the waterline placed the aviation fuel tanks in a position where a torpedo hit on the forward hull would inevitably reach them. This was a design consequence of the Taiho's weight. She was too heavy to keep all critical systems above the waterline. The elevator pit design was not a design error in isolation. It was the consequence of building a heavily armored carrier on a hull whose displacement was already near the limits of practical management. The second factor was the continuation of flight operations. Ozawa's decision to continue operations was tactically rational given what was visible from the bridge. It kept the vapor accumulation problem unresolved by preventing the isolation of the affected compartments that would have been the first step in correct vapor management. While aircraft continued to operate, the hangar deck and its adjacent spaces could not be sealed. The vapor continued to accumulate in a ship whose internal spaces remained connected to the elevator pit, through the ventilation system, and through structural gaps. The third factor was the ventilation decision. This is the specific decision that converted a survivable damage event into a catastrophic one. A torpedo hit on a carrier is not automatically fatal. Carriers have survived torpedo hits. The Taiho had been designed to survive torpedo hits. The flooding from the single torpedo strike was serious, but not by itself ship-destroying. What converted the flooding into a fatal event was the distribution of aviation fuel vapor throughout the ship's interior. That distribution was the consequence of the ventilation decision, and the ventilation decision was made by a crew member whose training had not covered this specific scenario. The fourth factor was the first deployment condition. The Taiho's crew had 3 months of service aboard her before June 19th. They had not managed this type of emergency on this ship before because no one had. The Taiho had never been in combat. The damage control procedures for her specific structural configuration had never been tested under operational conditions. The officer who made the wrong ventilation decision was not the only one affected by this condition. Every damage control procedure applied on June 19th was being applied for the first time by a crew that had trained for emergencies but had not practiced the specific emergency the torpedo produced. The paradox at the center of the Taiho's sinking is not subtle, but it is worth stating precisely. The Taiho was built to be immune to the attack that had destroyed 4 carriers at Midway. She was sunk by the accumulation of aviation fuel vapor produced by a single torpedo hit that reached the fuel tanks through the elevator pit below the waterline, combined with the damage control decision that spread that vapor to every space connected to the ventilation system. The armor that was her defining design feature was never tested. The torpedo that sank her would not have been stopped by the armor even if it had been applied to every surface of the ship, because it struck below the armor and below the waterline. The crew that had been trained to manage battle damage was not prepared for this specific type of damage because they had never encountered it before. The most advanced carrier Japan had built sank on the opening day of her combat debut, not because the enemy found her weakness, but because a crew member made the wrong decision about the ventilators. The Albacore never returned from her 7th and final war patrol. She departed Apra Harbor, Guam, in October of 1944 and was never heard from again. She was declared lost with all hands in November of 1944, presumed sunk by a Japanese mine south of Hokkaido. The submarine that sank the largest carrier Japan had built was itself lost with no survivors 5 months later. Commander Blanchard was not aboard the Albacore when she made her final patrol. He had already been reassigned to another command. He survived the war and was awarded the Navy Cross for the Taiho sinking. The Taiho rests on the floor of the Philippine Sea. She has been resting there since the afternoon of June 19th, 1944. 80 years. The Albacore lies somewhere south of Hokkaido, in water deep enough that she has never been successfully located or found. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you the stories. The naval history is reduced to a displacement figure and a sinking date, without telling you that the armored flight deck that was the defining feature of the carrier Japan built to be unsinkable from above was never struck by an enemy weapon on the day it sank. That warrant officer Komatsu dove his Zero into the path of a torpedo and destroyed it, and that the ship he died to protect sank anyway from a mechanism entirely different from the torpedo he intercepted. That the internal explosion came 6 hours after the torpedo hit, because a damage control officer opened all the ventilators instead of isolating the affected compartments, or that the submarine that sank her disappeared with all hands 5 months later and has never been found. Hit subscribe, then like, so this reaches the people who should understand what 1,650 dead inside the carrier built to be unsinkable means about the relationship between the weapons a Navy builds and the emergencies it cannot anticipate. Drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from. We will see you in the next one. The Taiho's sinking settled a specific and consequential question about armored carrier design that both the British and Japanese navies had been investigating before and during the war. British fleet carriers of the period, including the illustrious class, had armored flight decks that were thicker and more extensive than the Taiho's. The British carriers had demonstrated through combat experience that armored decks could substantially reduce the penetration of bomb hits. The Taiho's armored deck was designed with this British combat experience in mind, adapted for Japanese naval construction methods and fleet operational requirements. What the armored deck design had not adequately accounted for in either the British or Japanese implementations was the specific vulnerability of the ship below the waterline at the elevator pits. The Taiho's specific design flaw at the elevator pit was not unique to her class. It was a consequence of carrier design practice that prioritized protection from above at the cost of a structural arrangement that inadvertently created vulnerability from below. Ozawa survived the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the loss of his flagship, and the destruction of his carrier air groups. He continued to command and was responsible for the carrier force at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, where the Japanese carrier force served as a decoy to draw the American fleet away from the invasion beaches at Leyte. By that point, the Japanese carrier force had virtually no operational aircraft to launch in combat. The carriers that had formed the core of Japanese naval power at the start of the Pacific War, the force that had struck Pearl Harbor and dominated the first 6 months of the war, had been reduced to surface vessels without any meaningful air component. Ozawa flew his flag from ships whose primary tactical purpose was to be found and attacked. The catastrophic defeat he had suffered on June 19, 1944, with the simultaneous loss of 2 fleet carriers and over 400 carrier aircraft, had directly produced this outcome. The physical record of the Taiho's construction represents an investment in naval technology that was among the most significant of the Pacific War. The armored deck, the heavier internal bracing required to support it, the modified propulsion arrangement, and the modified aircraft handling system together represented design decisions made at the highest levels of the Japanese Naval General Staff in direct response to Midway. The engineers who designed the Taiho had solved the problem they were given: create a carrier whose flight deck cannot be penetrated by any bomb the Americans can deliver. They solved the specific problem they had been given. The bomb they had designed against never came. What came instead was a torpedo that struck below the armor entirely and produced an aviation fuel vapor accumulation that the ship's crew was not adequately prepared to manage. The engineers had fully solved the problem they were given. The problem they were given was not the problem that ultimately sank the ship. The American submarine record from the Battle of the Philippine Sea includes an element that has not always been adequately recognized in the primary accounts of the battle. The submarines USS Cavala and USS Albacore each sank a Japanese fleet carrier on June 19, 1944, on the same day that the carrier air battle above the fleet was destroying over 400 Japanese aircraft. The 2 submarines made no coordinated attack on the Japanese fleet. They were operating completely independently in their separately assigned patrol areas. The Cavala found the Shokaku because the Shokaku happened to be in the Cavala's area. The Albacore found the Taiho because the Taiho happened to be in the Albacore's area. The 2 carrier sinkings were coincidences of patrol area assignment and Japanese fleet movement, rather than the product of any coordinated submarine strategy. The combined result of those coincidences was the loss of 2 Japanese fleet carriers on a day when the carrier air battle was already producing a decisive and irreversible Japanese defeat. The account of Komatsu's action has been preserved in Japanese records of the battle and has been verified by subsequent historical investigation. His name appears in the documentation. His aircraft identification has been confirmed. The torpedo he destroyed has been traced in the spread pattern of the 6 torpedoes Blanchard fired. The act of an aviator choosing to use his aircraft to destroy a torpedo rather than watch it strike his ship is documented as a specific historical fact rather than as a legend of the Pacific War. It is the kind of individual action that produces a specific question. What did it mean for the outcome? The question is answerable in this case. It meant that one additional torpedo did not strike the Taiho's hull. It did not mean that the Taiho survived the day.